have ever attempted to seek your very own voice that is unique and authentic in the midst of many, many other voices that would tell you something different from what you feel inside as the real truth and as the right path. In this broadcast, we will look at a man who is named in the book of John chapter 3 as Nicodemus. And he is a man who seemingly had lost his voice to a group. My name is Kasisi Keriako Wakenyua, and welcome to this broadcast. In the translation that I have found myself putting in paper from the Greek text of John chapter 3 and verse 1 and 2, I will concentrate on just one line or bit of a line that says, Rabbi, hoidamen, hoti apotheo, elelusasi didaskalos. And here is my translation in both Kikuyu and English. But I start with English. Now, a man from the Pharisees, or from the Pharisees group, named Nicodemus, but the text here says his name was Nicodemus, a leader of the Judeans. You can say a leading Jew or a member of a Jewish leadership. And my Kikuyu translation there is Narere. Modurume wa gikundi kia Afarisayo. Wetagwa Nicodemus, monene wa Ayudea. I continue resisting, the temptation of translating that as Ayahudi. And line 2 says, he came to him at night and said to him, Rabbi, we know you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one is able to do the signs that you do unless God is with you. Agioka koriwe otuko kana ihinda ria nduma akimwira, Rabi, nitoi we murutani kuma kwi Ngai, tondu gutire ungihota gwika mawiko ta maya ureka tiga Ngai akorirwo hamwe nawe na hamwe nake. I hope that in the last or several broadcasts that you have worked with me, you have begun to understand what I've been trying to put across. That when you look at the gospel narratives, you don't go seeking history, because the intention of the writers was not history. The intention of the writers are specific understanding of who Jesus is or was to them. In John, you will have noticed that John begins to tell you a story about, or an event about Jesus. And he gives you a short description of an event, and then he moves on to something else. Close to how we tell short stories, but with a bigger picture in mind. Not expecting you to seek out inner details of the story, but something that speaks to something very specific that will lead you to the larger understanding of the text. So, as we have learned so far, and as it is my motto as Kasisi, we seek wisdom together so that we can gain understanding. And today's wisdom that we want to seek is finding that authentic voice that is in you, that sometimes is either silenced or covered up. We have learned, or we are told in that text that I've just read, that there is this man called Nicodemus. And we are told that he was from the Pharisees. And you have to work at the translation. You have to work around the translation to make sense of it, because it says from the Pharisees. But here we know that it's a man who came from a group of the Pharisees. And sometimes we may wonder, who were these? Because we meet them in Matthew, we meet them in Mark, in Luke, and in John. And they are depicted differently in all of these texts. Particularly Matthew is very brutal when he talks about the Pharisees. And I think the image that we have a lot about the Pharisees, even when we talk about the spirit of the Pharisees, is what that is depicted or that is revealed in the book of Matthew. But at the time Jesus came into the world, the Pharisees had become a very strong group. It was one among many other Jewish groups that had developed in the attempt to identify or to make an identity of themselves. And they struggled with the understanding of Jewish group as a kingdom of priests, a holy nation called by God. And they always wrestled with that and was asking, who is this? How should we be living as this chosen kingdom, as a people of God, as a priesthood, a royal priesthood? Some, like the Zealots, would say, hey, let us take up our guns. If it were today's, in our movement, they would say, let us take up our guns. But of course, they were taking swords to go and fight it and kill to get the kingdom. Others, another group of the so-called the Sadducees, they said, let's spend more time reading the Torah and trying to understand what we can gain from the Torah. There was also another group that said, no. They were called the Essenes. They would say, let us separate ourselves. We do not need to mix ourselves with anybody. Let us move out of the city, move out of these groups and go live into those other places. And definitely there was also the crowd of many other people who refused to identify themselves with any of these groups. But one of the most important of these groups was the Pharisees, which was very strong, mainly Judean and mainly middle class, as we would say. They were wealthy men and women, possibly, who refused to engage in politics. They were what we call apolitical. They refused to engage in the Roman dispensation, political dispensation that was happening at the time, but instead spent a lot of time studying and living the word that they were reading, the Torah. And because of their piety, they were deeply, deeply respected. It was a deeply respected group. And we see Nicodemus coming out of that group. But we are told he was a leader of the Judeans. So we expect him to be among the top of the leadership of the group. And if you read, I believe it is Exodus 24, you hear the invitation of Moses and Aaron and his sons to go up the mountain, and Moses is reminded to also bring with him a group of 70 elders. A tradition would develop within the Jewish leadership that speaks specifically to a group of leaders who would form what would later become the Sanhedrin in this case. And as they engage themselves in leadership, some of them would be very respected, and majority, of course, all of them would be respected. But what is interesting for me today is why John specifically tells us that Nicodemus was one of the Pharisees. This group was quite cohesive, was united. They worked together. They lived under what is today we would call collective responsibility. And therefore, meaning that you can not go outside the group thinking and the group interpretation and the group understanding. But when we look at Nicodemus, we realize that something was bothering him. There is something that was hindering him from listening to the authentic Nicodemus. And this, of course, was his, being in that group mentality. And groups and individuals sometimes can be very hegemonic. By this I mean they want you to follow, to stay within the lines, to stay within boundaries. You cannot go beyond these boundaries. And as we always say, we live in a very scripted society. Some of us, if you want to understand what beauty is, there is a script of beauty. If you want to understand who a Christian is, there is a script. And even some will go further and say, hey, we are not that kind of Christians. We are conservative. Or, no, we are liberal. Or, no, we are centrist. All these are labels that we put upon ourselves as boundaries, as scripts. And sometimes these boundaries and this group thinking, this so-called collective responsibility mentality, it suffocates authenticity and creativity. So that when you want to break out, you are always silenced and reminded, you know who you are. You wear in a certain way, you speak in a certain way, you eat in a certain manner, you drive certain cars, you live in a certain neighborhood, you don't mingle with so-and-so. And when you attempt to break out, some will even try to silence you. We know there are so many men and women, even within our communities that we know, that have tried to break out of the mentality. And then the voices that are outside are stronger. My call today, as we seek our authentic voice, is to break out from the group thinking, to break out from the so-called collective responsibility, to break out from the so-called script, and where you begin to find your authentic self. Some people will say, hey, think about outside the box. But I say, get out of the box. You don't have to be in the box to think outside of it. Get out of it if you want your freedom, your thoughts, your way of interacting with life and finding